Thank you to all of you. So we're now going to carry on with debate number 3, from the cost of healthcare products to the value of the results. So let me ask Laurence Comte-Aroussou, Pierre-Yves Gioffard, Guillaume Leroy, Valérie Paris, and the moderator will be Jean-David Zayoutoun. Yes, hello, and thank you for being here with us today. Thank you for being here for this new panel discussion, where we're going to talk about the cost of healthcare products and the value of the results obtained. So a few weeks ago, the company Novartis, which is one of the biggest pharmaceutical labs in the world, announced that the medication agency had approved a new product, cellular-based treatment. A new kind of treatment. Now, 99% of the products that we pick up in the pharmacy, whether in the hospital, they're molecular treatments, and that's a new cellular treatment where we try and capture the patient's cells, we reprocess them, retreat them, then we re-inject in the patient in order to reduce the illness, which may be fatal. Now, Scott Glipier, who is in charge of the agency in America, he carried out minor functions in the FDA, but he also worked for investment funds. And he's also known because he had a cancer about 10 years ago. He said that this was one of the greatest innovations and that the agency was very proud of approving the product. And there are other products that are currently being prepared before they are authorized to be marketed. And he said that given the extraordinary results obtained with the treatment, the laboratory was going to obtain a price between 600,000, 700,000 per patient for a few months of treatment. And Novartis was very reasonable. They said that the price was 450,000 per patient for a few months of treatment. So we're talking about very important treatments for things like cystic fibrosis, so very high prices. So does this have a certain value? Is it worth 450,000 euros per patient? Well, the value of the product, obviously it is valuable, the product, and it's short-term treatment, and it heals the patient. So there are a number of advantages. Now, I can't talk about whether the value matches the price. There are people like Peter Back, specialist, an oncologist who's is very highly reputed. He said, given the data available on the product, he didn't know whether it was too expensive or whether it could be twice as expensive. Now, if you will allow me, let me just come back to the concept of value in healthcare, because we have two competing concepts here. There are multiple definitions of value, but there are two competing rival concepts that exist together and that are used differently. There's, first of all, the idea that value is really a relationship between results and cost. Since the 90s, medical and economic assessments have been used in many healthcare systems so that decisions can be taken about healthcare coverage or about operations or actions with the different conceptions. Today, we have the extra welfare conception, where we look at the healthcare results and we calculate costs. What we're interested in is the survival of the patient according to quality of life, and then we compare that to the incremental cost. On all of this in relation to some comparison. Then we have a threshold value, or values rather, in mind to determine how much we're ready to pay for these incremental benefits. Now, this assessment has been used in systems for different operations and actions, but it really does focus on the medication itself. So that's what's assessed most in the healthcare sector. And so you apply the principle with great difficulty when you're defining prices, and I'll come back to that a little bit later on, if you like, in relation to this concept of value. On the other hand, there is more of a managerial approach. This is more recent. It's promoted by Michael Porter. It's what was described It's what was described earlier on in the previous panel discussion. In other words, we measure the results in terms of healthcare, of organizations providing healthcare, and we count on competition so that those with the greatest performance help us to make progress towards more value. Then we measure the results based on multiple dimensions. We have quality indicators relating to processes or possibly patients and their experience, or the way they feel after some kind of operation. This is what was described in the previous panel discussion. However, for operations that require a lot of human resources and a lot of capital, the pay is very much based on the production cost. And then we adjust this pay, this remuneration, according to the results with a bonus, or sometimes we remove points, and that's how we decide on the remuneration, depending on the result obtained. But we don't set the price of the operation according to the results. What we try and do, which is what we try and do in the medication field. Now, Michael Porter worked mainly on healthcare processes, not really on treatments. And that's because of the cancer. So you've talked about processes. Laurence, what about in the medical system? Do you have the impression that there is one of these approaches or both approaches that apply to the system? Well, let's talk about reality. In the medical system today, the price for us is the price of the old product. It's a negotiation with the CPRS. If it's not an innovative product, or if it is an innovative product and there's no organizational innovation, that's not the case, then the negotiations are never ending. That's why we very clearly, we work, as Valérie said, we work on the concept of healthcare value. We believe that it's a good opportunity, because if we focus on the result that is important for the patient, and if we focus on the impact that this has on the healthcare system, it's an opportunity for our system. It's a way of getting out of this sticky situation, because asking all companies and even us who are bigger, asking, how do we get an innovative product out on the market today, it really is just so difficult today. We've talked a lot about quality. Now, we say, okay, we can move from price to quality, but what is quality in France? And here we heard this in the previous panel discussion. It's about ticking boxes. Am I in the right room, the right ward? Am I eating the right apples? That's what quality is it? Well, really, this reflects the panel discussion from earlier on, Karine Lavril, who said, how do we go about things? Now, we're saying that we need to work all together. And in the case of diabetes, this is really a chronic disease. We need to remember that in 2025, 1/4 of the population will suffer from a chronic disease. So either we continue to have act-based payments for all conditions, or we include other solutions. And we've heard this as well. Financing can help a new form of management. And if we include the results that are important for the patient, if we think about a different kind of path, we will find the right solutions, and maybe solutions that are not as costly. Let me take an example. It speaks for itself. Now, in the room, we all have patients and friends, or somebody we know, suffering from morbid obesity. How do you deal with somebody like that? How, you can operate on them, but they suffer from judgment. But are we doing too much bariatric surgery? So 10,000 to 65,000 people. But is that the subject? How do we heal these patients? But bariatric surgery is very useful. But can we lose one patient out of two with this kind of problem? It takes 7 years. What's important for the patient? What's important for the patient is that he or she is no longer obese, they can work, and they are positively judged by their children and the friends of their children. And that's something we have to focus on. So what you mean is that as an industrialist, you're ready to take part in the patient's healthcare path to guarantee the results, but at the same time, you want to be able to either maintain your prices or have something that's higher. No, we're not talking about raising prices. What we've done, we've created a think tank, and what we're already suggesting, this is what we saw in the previous roundtable, it's important to focus on communication. We're talking about different outcomes, different things, but there's no link between them. So we're completely lost. So please download what we refer to as a manifesto. So it's fairly aggressive, this word manifesto. Have a look at what we put forward with our think tank. We need to talk about the same thing, and it's also important to get moving, to start acting. We're very good when we work for an American company. This is the first reproach we have. You're very good at talking, but what about acting? What we suggest is that we identify a number of pathways where we can work together, all of us, all professionals, with specific financing, because we can't, of course, bear all of the financing as companies. So we need to work together. We need to set up some groups. We can make mistakes, but then we can correct those mistakes. Pierre, in the School of Economy, all economists are there trying to do something about these problems. Yes, or they will be soon. Let me come back to what you said in your introduction. You talked about the estimated value of the new product. You talked about the price that was negotiated. But what about the production cost? Because that's an interesting concept. When we talk about these issues, the price of drugs, etc., most of the time what we hear is people saying, OK, but the production cost is very low, and they're selling this product at a very high price. They're selling it in Egypt for 500 euros or thousands of dollars or whatever. So we need to get rid of that logic. We need to connect the price to the additional cost. That you've got an estimation of the cost, but then there's a reasonable margin, a fair margin for the innovative efforts. That's the wrong kind of way to think about it. It means that people think about this wrong. So the idea is to move away from that. Who cares about the production cost? If a lab innovates with a product that provides huge amounts of benefits and values, now, of course, we can talk about value and who it's for, etc. We can talk about that all day. But if it does provide a lot of value to society, even if it doesn't cost very much to produce, you have to pay for it at a very high price. And similarly, if the new drug, doesn't provide much, because there are innovations that don't actually have great values, then it shouldn't be sold at a high price. Okay, too bad, you've innovated, but the value is very low, so we're not going to pay for that, even if the production cost is high. So we need to change the way we think about these things. We need to completely rebalance things. So we're talking more about value. Yes, we're talking more about value. And there are many questions that we need to ask. How do you define value? Who is it for, etc. But also, how do you revise the value? Because the value that you estimate and the $600,000 for the treatment that we were talking about, that's estimated before the product is put out on the market. So we're going to have surprises in reality. We're going to be learning things. So biotech, there's a biotech company that is considered as a flagship company with clinical tests. There was a death, so there are always risks. But there's also the question of, how do you revise the value in relation to the information that we have that reflects reality?
We have to admit that the things have to be reevaluated, reassessed, and it has to be done on a systematic basis. Not every day, of course, but we have to reevaluate things and change the conditions for the remuneration and the payment. So this means it's a complete change of the distribution of risk between the professionals, the producers, and the patients, and the financing authority. Guillaume Leroy, you've just joined us. You're the head of your company now, as of Sunday. As of Sunday, the 1st of October, after the CHAM. See, the industry has said a lot that the production costs was one of the reasons why prices were so high. and you said that we should stop saying this. I would like to share. I was 20 years abroad, and when you come back to France, and as I've done just now, something that strikes me. First of all, we have a very good health ecosystem. I'm quite convinced of that. We have a tendency to complain. When you look at our health indicators, are always very good. When we look at our research capacity, we are three of the biggest centers in the world. We have a hospital and university network which is quality with excellent practitioners. We have 22,000 pharmacies, not only to distribute medications, but also to give proximity to the patients. To have a meeting place between the patient, it's the illness and the drug and the health professional. That's important. So we have a very good health system in France. But I have an observation is that when you talk to the patient who perceives the value because the patient sees this, who's sensitive to this value because he's going to be healed after this hospitalization or after the treatment, the patient doesn't think at all of the cost and the price because we're talking about the pain. Yes, the Figaro did a survey that said most patients underestimate the price. They don't even know how much it costs to spend a day in the hospital. In the same way, at the same time, the paying authority, sees the medication or the health treatments only on the basis as a cost center. So on the one hand, we have the payer who's focusing on the cost for economic reasons, and we can't ignore that completely. So of course there are constraints, and we know that we can't absorb all of the costs of the demographic changes. And of course, it focuses on the management of the budgets, and we know what the difficulties that there are here. So finally, we have two realities that don't really talk to each other. On the one hand, you have the cost management, which is of course important, and you also have the value perception without the cost being associated. So from my point of view, of course the value issue is essential, and we're going to come back to it, but there has a citizen value as well. The civic value is what? Of course, it's the medical value. We are here to provide health solutions in order to heal or prevent illnesses, whether infectious or chronic. The second value point, that's essential, and we all basically agree with this in this room, is the value for the health system. Everything that's going to provide efficiency for the health system has a very high value. Even for the patient, he's treated in the same manner. That's important. All the innovations that are provided, the reduced hospitalization, these are of great value for our health system. But the innovations that provide prevention, great value, but it's not enough. The civic value is what? It's the value that's what's going to increase growth in our country in order to increase the financing for health developments. So the system in France is extraordinary for research and development, but the economy of knowledge is a great source of value. Intellectual property, research and development funds, this is essential, and also the economic value from employment. Once again, drugs are very important here. Not only do we do research in France, we produce in France, and then in France exports. So I'm going to give you a figure. When we sell €1 of drugs in France, we invest 1.2 euros for the research and development. And we export for €6 to the rest of the world. So that's a civic contribution of drugs, not only in the central authorities in Paris, but in all the different parts of France. The number of sites is extraordinary. And the societal footprint of our industry is huge. And the networking with universities and research centers is really a great source of value. Now, what we also often say is that we have to distinguish healthcare from the industries, but that's an error to separate the industry from the society. So 2 drugs out of 3 come from biotechnology. Biotechnology is a complete transformation of the industry from research, from the industrial part, from the regulation itself. A biological product is not the same as a chemical product. There are completely different ways of working. It's not just the molecule or the box of drugs, but the solution for tomorrow is the health solution that's going to integrate a certain number of components, including the medication. We've talked a lot about digital and information and the accompanying the patient in order to regulate the patient's treatment, to handle the diabetes, based on the information systems that are available. Of course, this is a way that we can have health evolve. This is how we can increase efficiency to avoid rehospitalization or worsening of the illness. Mrs. Paris, Mr. Leroy is talking about the efficiencies thanks to the healthcare system. But you often measure these different indicators. Do you have the impression that when the industrialists say that we're going to gain an efficiency from a drug, do you think that the payer does get these efficiency gains, or is the system too lacking in transparency? It's a difficult question, but it's true that a lot of drugs provide a lot to the patient and to the health system in terms of efficiency. We measure, for example, that better compliance with treatment could save a lot of money for the healthcare system, whether it's for France and the United States. There have been studies that show this, reducing hospitalization and helping patients to control their illness. But now, then we come to the fair price of a drug, on which it's interesting to return, because in France, we stayed on a negotiation with CEPS, which does not base itself, which may take into account of the economic and medical evaluation for a certain number of medications right now, but despite everything, is not based entirely on that information in order to negotiate a price, and that stops only on the medical value. It doesn't look at the civic value based on the research and development. For a product developed in France, it's not important. Yes and no. Yes, from the efficiency of the healthcare system, I think that it's not legitimate to count the jobs in France in order to set the price of a drug. Now, no, I don't agree with you there. Of course we don't agree, but we set the price of a new drug that's patented, that arrives. We don't try to obtain the lowest possible price, because our payers are aware that if we want to maintain a private system with innovations that's based on patents and on the possibility of charging a monopoly price at least until the arrival of a competitor, it's necessary so that investments will continue. And this is where the price that we grant plays a big role in terms of a signal. As a signal, what are the innovations for which we are ready to pay and how much? And this signal is quite important, because we see that it can guide investments of companies, pharmaceutical companies. Today, we have very important development in oncology and in medicine, drugs for children, notably because in recent years, we pointed out, and we saw in behavior in other countries, people that we were ready to pay very high prices for oncology and children's drugs. So it's very important. So this perhaps is an aspect that we can come back later on, if you like, the performance agreements. Because here again, I've read that the Novartis, over and above its price, reimburses the drug for patients who don't get healed. So these are types of agreements that are being developed. We have analyzed this somewhat, and we see a certain number of opportunities, but also limits. And if you like, we could talk about this later. I want to just ask Madame Contarius, when we say that when we set the price, we also send a signal to the medical system. Do you have the impression that that you're properly treated, or that whether you're just here in France or around the world? So I'm going to take on. So globally, we get the impression that we're badly treated, and I'm going to come back to the video. We have to remember that 80% of companies are small medical companies. Now, most of these companies, there's no link, and we don't want to have one. Most of these companies often sell much more abroad than they do in France, since the system is slow and complex and not very innovative. If they sold more in France, they would sell even more abroad, and the mathematics are very simple. They would create jobs. So there is a link. We have to stop saying there's no link. There is one. The second thing, yes, we're poorly treated. The answer is yes, we are, because, well, I'm going to give you an example, because it's very topical, and it's currently being negotiated. In diabetes, there are patients who have very high hypoglycemia who are using insulin pumps. We have a file on which with about 6,000 patients, and we can't find a solution with the healthcare system with them. perhaps we'll find a solution in the very near future, but maybe not. But it's just we're in discussions with prices where the cost, I won't hide it to you, it's a much lower price than in the rest of the countries in the world, or we can't because we're losing money, so we're not even allowed to do that. And we can't find a solution while saying what is important. We're talking about 6,000 patients. We're going to allow these patients to no longer have severe hypoglycemia, to manage their hyperglycemia, to encourage a closed loop that everyone talks about, but that we don't have to market it because we don't have a system for marketing it. And we're in negotiations that are pointless almost. Yes, that way we're badly treated, yes. However, but there are also times, to come back to the performance agreements, where we found solutions. And here we have good examples. So when we want to, we can. For example, we have new stimulators where there's the agreement. It says it should last 9 years, and if it doesn't last 9 years, we reimburse it. So it's a shared risk. And we could also continue to develop this approach even more. There's risk sharing is important, and we can take risks and we can take them together. For example, we have products. We can demonstrate the patients are going to with implantables. We can show that patients will use less coagulants. So if the patients use less anticoagulants, we will be paid more. And if we don't get to that point, well, then we won't get paid as much. What is risk? So what's expensive? What's expensive in medical innovation? First of all, it's the risk, the hazards of innovation. If we're going for innovation rather than expertise, so you have to test things. You have to test lots of projects that don't work out. And the second essential point for the development cost is the question of time. Now the constraints are greater and greater, and that's normal. To have all the data on efficiency, it's even digitalization that's helped. This notion of time is extremely long. We need a year to develop TV, 5 years to develop a plane, 15, 20 years to develop a molecule. It took us 22 years to market the product for dengue fever. Yeah. And the initial research which was 40 years. And now this is the biggest wastage of value today is because of time. How can you explain for a product for good or bad reasons is going 12, 28, 24 months before it's released to the market? And yet it's already available. It's not supportable for the patient because sometimes the patient doesn't want to wait for a negotiation and wait for hazards and have to do calculations in different administrative points. We have to think of the patient. If we can gain just a year, just 1 year, we mustn't dream. We have a closed budgetary envelope. We can justify all the value in what we want, but in the end, we won't have the means to go any further. We have our budget envelope. The only thing we can do very quickly, all of us together in this room, is to gain time. If we gain on time in the choice, in our adjustments and our decisions, the future products will be released on the market 1 year before, 1 year earlier. The treatments will be better. There will be more efficiency in the healthcare system. The civic value will be confirmed since we will have made our researchers, our French researchers work, and also our factories. And I'm sorry, but I'm very much attached to that because I'm one of these French citizens, so that's important to me. And these 2 years of marketing, it's a discount. So the fact that you have to refund money to companies to get them to work faster, that does work. Things are done in France. So you're ready to do that in France? No, we know the United States. I'm not thinking about advantage of dengue fever is a good example. We would never have been able to use 22 years to develop this product. We had agreements with the authorities, so we had a fast track on all the decision making in order to guarantee the time necessary for science, that was essential, and the health safety, and then to reduce all the time to reviews and administrative elements so that the product could be available much more quickly. So this gives a price much more quickly. So a fast track system, if you propose to work on a major innovation, you have a fast track. And if the product goes right through to its end, because it's met the expectations that we had for the patient, in that case you have a voter who is going to give you It's going to give you like a leg up for next innovation. And so this is a reduced part of the price. It's several hundred million euros that could be associated with 6 months, 12 months, or 18 months of making a product available. Yeah, Pierre wanted to say something. Now, this is, we have to go to pay the industry to go faster. And we've been doing this for 25 years in the United States, but I'm talking about these medical systems here. It's not the interest of the system to go faster, because if we don't accelerate, it's kind of like the retirement. We're still thinking it's not too serious because we're going to get our retirement, our pension. You're all quite young on the table, but our children, the healthcare system that we're talking about, and that we all find very good, it's not going to stay the way it is. This is reality. So it's not only only up to the industrialists to go faster. Thierry, no, I wanted to point that was mentioned, the budget. We're talking about the budgetary envelope, or the absence of funds, or the absence of fungibility of these envelopes. And this is something that's directly linked with the value-based pricing. Why? Let's take an example of a drug that has a good benefit, a significant benefit to the patient who's being treated, and reduces hospitalization at the same time. So the benefit we have to take into account in this value. Also the fact that the resources that were saved by the fact that we have fewer hospitalizations. But this is legitimate only if actually if the system can reduce the resources devoted to hospitalization and to transfer them to drugs. Of course, that's a notion that we do as well. Now, 20 years, people don't die in the hospital from that anymore. So if we don't redeploy, if we don't look at redeploying according to the benefits and the values, there's a whole part of the benefits from innovation that's we're going to lose. We're going to continue paying for resources, even though as though there had been no innovation. So, and then we're going to pay for the innovation as well. So of course, the supervisory authority is going to say innovation has less value than what it could really have if we really devoted means that are for redeploying. It's really a question that's very important. The idea of adaptation to innovation, and also includes replacing work time with products or with drugs. So it's an excellent thing. If we can do better with less work, we'll all be happy with that. It's a good thing we're creating work and creating jobs. It's not necessarily a good thing. It's obviously we're not going to close half the hospital because we've optimized hospitalization, which is more adapted, which provided in the city and not the hospital. We understand that. So for the budget, hospital budget, it doesn't change the proportions however, during this time we've treated the patient, we've invested in research, we've created an economy of knowledge. France is an economy of knowledge, the teaching and intellectual property. It's extraordinary. And third point, we've also made factories operate. We had the teams working and people working together in order to advance. Yes, the impact isn't transformed in lower prices for the hospital, lower costs but it creates value for the country.
Do you agree with that? Yes, absolutely. And what about you? At the OECD, you have an international vision. Do you think there are other countries that are doing better than what Pierre-Yves was saying when they're reducing the costs of the most expensive structures, for example? Well, certain countries do a better job, especially when they have budgetary problems such as Greece or Portugal. They have to drastically reduce their expenditures, but that's not necessarily to the benefit of the patient, so we need to emphasize that. However, concerning this question of the budget defined in silos, one of the things that we learned from a study that was carried out recently is that when the governments set these budgets, often in silos, they often don't take into account the innovations that are arriving or even market dynamics. For example, patent expiry in the field of drugs. You have certain, there's pressure upwards, but there's also downward pressure to reduce costs when the patents expire. So sometimes people will say, well, there's going to be 0% increase this year and then 0.5% increase for drugs next year without actually even taking into account the innovations or the patent expiries that are arriving in the pipeline. So I think this is something that needs to be done for better resource allocation. That's very important because it's all very well to put pressure on innovations. But the products with high medical value that have no competitors because they're difficult to produce, they've been available in the market for many years. Why should these products have absolute pressure on prices with a social and societal impact that's immediate, although they have a medical value for the healthcare system that's essential? Now, you are talking about prices, but I think we're losing sight of the fact that there is something that's historical, which is that the price of new drugs is reaching levels that have never been reached. So $50,000 to $100,000 a year is just frequent today. And there are several products in the U.S. and Europe that are at $400,000 to $500,000 a year. So obviously, the academics, doesn't that bother you? Or what about the people representing industry here? Well, there are new treatments. There used to be treatments that were very expensive, but that concerned rare diseases for which there were always unit costs that were very high for some of these rare diseases. But what's new, what's recent, that's totally changed the game is sofosbuvir, for example, that arrived with a very high treatment cost for a pathology with very high prevalence. So that meant all of a sudden we found ourselves with a problem that appeared to become a budgetary problem, because a drug that just concerns a few patients a year, even if it's 500,000 euros a year, we can assimilate that into budgets. If it's 40, 50, 90,000 a year and concerns a huge percent of the population, then that's another problem at another scale. That's the new phenomenon, which is up until now, drugs for widely prevalent pathologies were not so expensive in the past. Well, I think that what is preoccupying financiers is the financial backers is that these drugs with small and large target populations are multiplying due to genetic therapies concerning, for example, orphan diseases. We're seeing more and more of these drugs. So a very high price for a small population, a target population, can work. But if this is multiplied for a lot of different rare diseases, such as Evaluate and IMS, who are making predictions, appear to believe, this will become a budgetary problem. And I think we need to keep in mind the benefits of the drug for the patient or the system. Is it a huge therapeutic contribution? A patient who cures from a lethal disease, obviously this is a vital drug. Or if it prolongs survival by 1 or 2 months, is that such an interesting benefit? It does help research move forward. It is incremental, we can understand that, but that perhaps doesn't merit such a high or excessive price. So yes, that raises the question of the value that we haven't talked about much. Everyone agrees, I think, to say that it's very difficult to measure value. Nicolas Bouzou was talking about life expectancy, which is a poor indication of the value of treatment. And Victor Fuge, who's the Dean of Healthcare Economists, says the value of a life can be measured at the number of people who come to your funeral. If you're very young, we have an impression that it has a high value and there won't be that many people. If you have there will be more people at my funeral at my age because I'm older. So perhaps that's a citizen's decision. What is the value that we want to give to life expectancy? That's up to society to decide. Once you've defined a certain, if you say 1 year of life expectancy is worth 500,000 euros, why not? Then you define it. And then you talk about this. And this can't be the laboratory or the regulator or the CEPS who have a conflict between their budgets. This is why we need to go back perhaps to what we call the citizen's value of healthcare. Is it easy to measure the value of a life as an economist? What would you say? Well, there's one part that can be well, what's important is that there should be a statistical value for life expectancy that's used as a reference in a cross-cutting fashion. So Marcel Boiteux once said, how much does nuclear safety cost us? He said it's very expensive because we spend way too much for nuclear safety. By spending the same amounts in other sectors, we could save many more lives and reduce mortality. So that's the utilitarian view. But yes, it does express something. If there are places where you're not spending much money. You could reduce mortality and reduce highway accidents, and then other areas where we spend huge amounts of money to reduce the number of deaths per year by 10 or by 100, then we should probably do A rather than B. So we have to accept the fact that we can't reach zero risk. This doesn't exist. So to say that the level of risk should be the same, the resources that we spend to reduce the risk and to save lives in certain systems, safety systems, it should be fairly homogeneous. So when we try to actually carry out these evaluations, we reach a level of consternation that's very high, because obviously we see that in certain sectors a lot of money is spent, and in others for certain tests or diagnoses, for blood tests, for example, millions are spent per case avoided. So it's not very consistent. But having this cross-functional, transversal rod stick, as the English say, would allow us to identify efficiency improvements. So when you see that the share is 0.0, or sorry, that some drugs are spending very little on drugs. Well, the debate that we have today is almost surrealistic, because if we imagine that the value and the price to pay for a drug should be or could be independent from the social value, I think that's absurd. So we should already all agree, I think we all agree, that the price should take into account the value. What do we include in that value? Then how do we calculate that value? That can be discussed. And how do we divide the value? That can be complicated. The value is not necessarily the same for all patients. That's also another point that's important. A drug can be distributed and be used for a whole group of patients, and then within the patients, some of them will benefit more than others from the same drug. So then we can have interpretations of the value and interpretations of the price. So you could have different prices according to the patient. Yes, you could have a menu of contracts from the health authority that says we can give you a low price but with certain wide therapeutic indications, or a higher price with more restricted therapeutic indications, because this patient group, we know that there's a real value and a higher benefit. For the others, there is a benefit, but that's lower. We could imagine that type of thing. But in all cases, we need to know that assessment has a cost, evaluation has a cost. We need to be transparent in these questions. There are also mechanisms that have been proposed. For example, when you have a good assessment, well, the value, there's always a margin of uncertainty when you're trying to calculate the value, and then you take decisions to reimburse and market or authorize drugs on the market. And these decisions are imperfect. When there's a good quality of information and a good estimation of the value, we could imagine that there would be a higher price. This is also something that we can envisage. But once you enter this rationale of remunerating in terms of value, then you have to look at the value of the information that allows you to reach this value. And that's not free to produce this information. But it's true, if you look at the budget of NICE in the British system, they've started looking at this type of pricing based on value for many years now. The resources that are devoted to assessment it's not just, it's very consequential. Well, for medical devices, assessment, we don't see the same type of figures. It doesn't exist. Yes, you can measure the value. There are already centers that are measuring this in France. In the University Hospital in Strasbourg, they measure the actual healthcare value for colorectal patients. We know that this helps make savings, and so they're going to publish something soon. In a century such as Marie-Lalonde, where we have the management who are here with us, they tried to look at whether they could measure value, and they decided that, yes, they could measure the value. And once you communicate, once you explain, doctors are completely in agreement to do so, because doctors are like us. They want to continue to work in an environment where they continue to innovate, where they can continue to if we come back to the first roundtable, continue perhaps to have new activities. All of us are in the same basket. So they're very open-minded, and it's possible. But let me come back to the first point. This must help us to find specific financing, because if we're stubborn and we've got our blinders on and we continue to work as we did in the past, it won't work. So we have to accept to change certain things, to make mistakes, and accept to correct ourselves. And that's how we will succeed. And I think we're lacking this determination. Well, maybe it's easier for medical devices than for drugs, because medical devices are almost all connected. So it is a little bit easier perhaps to measure. No, you don't agree with that. Well, all connected? No. Well, increasingly connected, yes, but not all connected. And however, there is an effect of telemedicine. We've been talking about telemedicine here at CHAM for years, but where did you see the coverage of even if things are connected, this doesn't necessarily help the system. And no, there are certain medical devices that haven't yet been connected. Guillaume and Laurent, we have 4 minutes left. Well, I think what I'll take home from this discussion is that we have all the ingredients to build together tomorrow's healthcare system, which will face these economic constraints and its demographic growth and the arrival of innovation. France is a land of innovation. We should be able to accept this innovation and give people every mean to succeed with the innovation. And the economic value created by the industry, 400,000 people in our research centers, they're exceptional. There are very few countries in the world, 3 or 4, in this condition. And so we're very lucky in France. And so we rapidly have to be able to find ways to assess value and based on that to then define a price in the broad sense, not just for drugs, but for the health service. And we also need to continue to work to serve patients, to bring genuine innovations, reinforcing what already exists, and to do it responsibly at every level and with a lot of modesty, because we know that combating new disease will not be easy. So I think you all almost agree, aside from the industrial policy, well, we have made progress. I think you all agree that we have made progress. Now, today, does the price of drugs really reflect their value? If we focus on something such as high cholesterol, 25 years ago when statins arrived, they cost 10 francs in France instead of 1 franc. And today they're new intravenous molecules, although today statins cost 10 to 15 euros per month. And the new molecules are at 14,000 euros per month, a year in the US. Well, they haven't arrived in France yet. So, well, I think in some places it's been multiplied by 140. What would you say? Well, if I've understood, these products provide a therapeutic benefit to a small portion of patients with a rare form of high cholesterol. So what is important to distinguish is to set the price according to this and to make sure that these drugs are used properly and that they're not systematically replacing the drugs for each person who has complained of the adverse effects of statins. So the management, the appropriate use of drugs is also a very important aspect when setting prices. I just wanted to come back to one point. It seems to me that it's important to be more precise in France when we define the measures to pay for new drugs or how much we should pay for new innovative drugs. I think that the Norwegian model to define these willingness to pay, they define different thresholds based on the cost-efficacy ratio, but according to the disease and the benefits that the patients might lose if they don't have access to this innovation. They also take into account the budgetary impact to possibly think about a progressive entry into the new therapies and not just drugs. They're also thinking in terms of investment in Norway, if we have to pay for this or not, and if we have budgetary constraints, perhaps we need to abandon financing something else. And it's a consultative process in Norway, which seems to be accepted by the population at large. Obviously, the implementation may be more difficult when you refuse access to certain treatments for certain patients. 40 seconds you have to conclude. On the value, I'd like to conclude with just a bit of a joke. We're all convinced that estimating value should be given more attention when setting prices So I think we all agree on that. But taking into account value should not wait for many more years. Thank you all. Thank you for everyone in the room who've been attentively listening.